So this is a diagram of the sensory receptors in skin. Okay, so in skin, we know we have hair growing in skin. There's also two layers. There's going to be the epidermis, this lighter colored layer, and deeper layer that's called dermis, highlighted in blue. So the dermis has the most abundance of the special receptors. For example, it's going to have these really branched receptors called Merkel discs that respond to touch. These a little bit more complex looking special receptors, sensory receptors that are called end bulbs, also respond to touch. There's some of the sensory receptors that are called hair root plexuses that respond to the movement of the hairs. So something touches our hairs, we can feel that. There's these Ruffini endings that respond to pressure. There are these really crazy looking Pacinian corpuscles also respond to pressure. Meissner's corpuscles that respond to touch. So as you can see, there's quite a variety of different structures of sensory receptors. Some are an extension of the sensory nerves, like the branches of the dendrites, and some are a little bit more complex looking and surrounded by various capsules. There's even sensory receptors that extend into the epidermis. They're very, very branched. They're called free nerve endings, and these ones are respond to pain, heat, and cold. Okay, so what you need to take out of this diagram is that there's a variety of sensory receptors in our skin, and there's also other body parts, but skin is like extremely sensitive, so it's going to have more sensory receptors. So the more sensory receptors by number, not necessarily by type, that a body structure has, the more sensitive it is to a sensation. And the less of these receptors, the less dense in receptors the skin or other body part is, the less sensitive it's going to be to a sensation. And our skin is doesn't have an even distribution of the sensory receptors. Some parts of the skin, like the fingertips, have a lot more sensory receptors as opposed to like the the back of our neck, for example, has less sensory receptors than the skin of the fingertip. When it comes to general senses, the sensory receptors for touch are called mechanoreceptors. There's many different types, as we saw in the previous picture. The receptors for temperature are called thermoreceptors, and there's only two types, the hot and the cold. The receptors for pain are called nociceptors. The receptors for proprioception are called, there's two types. There could be called joint kinesthetic receptors located in our joints. They respond to the movement of our joints. And muscle spindles. Those are located in the muscle tissue and in a skeletal muscle tissue, and they respond to stretch. Together, they provide us with information about our musculoskeletal movement and position. And the chemical receptors are called chemoreceptors, and there's also many different types. So one chemoreceptor type for each type of chemical, and there's so many different chemicals. So like glucose detecting chemoreceptors is one type. Then there's going to be sodium detecting chemoreceptors, so many different types. For special senses, vision is detected by photoreceptors in our eyes. There's two types of photoreceptors. Actually, there's more than two types. There's four. They're called rods and cones. Rods detect the brightness of light, so they give us the black and white vision. And cones, they detect colors, and they give us colored vision. There's three types of cones: the red, green, and blue. Hearing is detected by special mechanoreceptors in our ears called the hair cells. Balance is also detected by special mechanoreceptors in our ears called hair cells. They're located in different compartments of the inner ear. Smell is detected by special chemoreceptors in our nose. There's called olfactory receptors, and there's many different types of olfactory receptors. I believe we can detect 10,000 different chemicals with our nose. So there's going to be 10,000 different types of olfactory receptors in our nose. The taste is a little bit simpler than smell. There's going to be only 5 types of chemoreceptors that detect taste. They're collectively called gustatory receptors, so there's going to be 5 types of gustatory receptors. Interestingly, spicy is not a taste, it's a sensation more closely related to pain and heat, and it is activated by a chemical called capsaicin that is very abundant in red hot chili peppers. So we're going to focus on vision next. Vision is provided to us by our eyes. Our eyes have special structures inside of our eyeballs. We can see the eyeball between the eyelids. So the eyeball is protected by the 2 eyelids, the upper eyelid, the larger one, and the smaller one is the lower eyelid. And the eyeball itself is made out of this white tissue called the sclera. So in the middle of the front portion of the eyeball, there is a colorful round structure called the iris. The iris is actually a muscle, and the reason why it's colored is because it's covered by a special translucent tissue called the cornea, and the cornea provides the color to the iris. So the darker the cornea, the less color the iris has, the more brown it appears. So if the cornea has a lot of melanin in it, the pigment that makes our skin brown, then the eyes will appear more brown too. And the less pigment the cornea has, the more colorful the iris appears. So the iris itself doesn't actually have color. It's actually, interestingly, very dark in color.